Bonjour et bienvenue à Français avec Liszty. And today we're going to talk about conjugating. One thing to note is that whenever you try to conjugate a verb, it must align with the subject of the sentence. The subject can either be a name of a person, a noun, or it can also be like a pronoun. For example, like I, you, he, she, it, and so on. And as you can see here, there's a list of pronouns, each of them categorized into the singular and the plural. Now for singular, we have three types. The first person singular, second person singular, and third person singular. Now for the first person singular, you have je, which means I. Now, as you may have noticed, I've also written a J with an apostrophe. Now, that's because in French there are some verbs that start with a vowel. For example, avoir, écrire, or ouvrir, and that's why it's here. And for second person singular, we have tu, which means you. It's basically also the same, like for example in Spanish, Italian, or Latin. For the third person plural, we actually have three types of it. Just like in English, we have three types, like he, she, and it. Now it's basically the same in French for the first two. However, for the third one, we have on. And I actually wrote an explanation as to why it's there. Now, even though on can mean we, it is deemed informal in the French language, which means you can use it in everyday conversations, but when we try to write something, you have to use the formal version of it, which we'll talk about later. Now, on, it actually aligns more with the English term one. I actually forgot like the term, like how to use like the noun one in a sense, like for example, one has to do that, or one should not think of that. You get the memo, but I just forgot the term, sorry. But anyways, we'll move on to the plural form. Now in the plural form, we also have three types. Now the first person plural is called nous, which is the formal way of saying we in French. Now nous means we. I forgot to write it down, sorry. And then the second person plural, we have vous, which means you, but in a plural sense. Just like in English, like if you okay, no, it's like saying like you all are, basically. Never mind. I was supposed to go to PL and then a dot, but I accidentally added a dot, but anyways. And then for the third person plural, we use il or elle. Now before I explain what these are, you may have noticed that all of these pronouns start with an S. However, they are silent S's, which means they are not meant to be spoken. Now, back to the third person plural. Il and elle both mean they. Now, you may be wondering what's the difference. In the third person plural, it's whenever you describe a group that is masculine, which is il. I'll use color, where for masculine it's blue. Or whenever you describe a group that is entirely female, or that is feminine, which is elle. I'm going to use the red color. Now, I know there are going to be some people who will ask, Liszty, whenever there's a group of mostly female but there's one male, which pronoun should I use? Now, in those types of cases, in the rules of the French language, you have to use il. I don't know why, but it is what it is. Anyways, now we talk about the conjugating and all of the pronouns. We can now move on to actually conjugating a verb. Now, the verbs I'm going to show you are the first verbs a French beginner would learn. Alright, we're going to move on to the verbs. Now, this is the first verb that a French beginner would learn. It is called avoir. And avoir means to have. Now, a note is that avoir is one of the irregular verbs, just like in English. For je, we have j'ai. Now the next one is tu, which you'll have tu as. Now for il and on, you have a. Now we move on to the plural. For nous, we have nous avons, which is important to say, by the way. And then for vous, we have vous avez. The last one, we have il, elle, on. Now, let's move on to the next verb. We have être, which means to be, which is also an irregular verb. Now let's move on. Now we have je, this time with an apostrophe because it does not start with an, with a vowel. I meant by conjugated verb, by the way, which is je suis. Now the next one is tu, which is actually tu es. I know it's weird, but it is what it is. And then you have il and on, basically the same thing, but with a T at the end. Et. Now let's move on to the plural. For nous, we have nous sommes. That actually was an O, whatever. And then you have vous, which is vous êtes. Also a silent S. And then we have il, elle. Sont. Now the difference between on and sont is that the S here, which basically at the side, has to be spoken out loud. And if you don't, it would sound like this one, basically. Now we're going to move on to the next two verbs. Now we're going to move on to these two verbs. Now these two verbs are both and also irregular verbs. What a shocker! But anyways, we're going to move on to aller, which means to go. Now to conjugate them in the following pronouns, we're going to start with je, which is going to be je vais. I know that looks like an E, but it's an I. It's just my handwriting. Now for tu, you just take out the I from vais, and you end up with tu vas. Now if you want for il and on, just take out VS, and then you have va. God, it kind of looks like a gamma. And then we'll move on to nous. This time we have to unfortunately use the vowel. As regular words, what can I expect from them? Anyways, it's going to be nous allons. Actually, I should move the verb, but anyways. Now for vous, same thing, but instead of O and S, on or on, we're going to have et, which means aller. Now for il and elle, it is actually the same as être, instead with an S at the beginning. We have a V. Ils, elles vont. Now we're going to move on to the next verb, which is called faire, or faire quelque chose, which means to do something. Now for the conjugated verbs. Now for je, it's going to be je fais. But what about tu? Do we have to change something? Well, fortunately, in this case, you don't have to. It's just the same thing. Tu fais. For il and on, all you have to do, well, it's basically kind of the same. All you have to do, just take out the S and then a T. Now for nous, we're gonna take this, but instead of just that, we're gonna add an ending. Basically, on. Nous faisons. Now for vous, we're gonna actually take this. Vous faites. Now I know if you may notice that usually for vous, the ending does not end with a Z. But we'll talk about the usual endings later on. Then we're moving on to the next one. Il and elle, same as être and aller. Il, elle, font. Now these are the two verbs. Now to summarize all of the verbs that we have just learned today, I'm going to actually make a new segment where it's going to show all of the verbs in a table so that you all can make a screenshot. So I hope you had fun learning about the conjugating verbs and the 4 verbs. Now the next video we'll talk about is articulation. Alright, au revoir.